Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video episode number 59. And if you're listening on the podcast platform, season 3, episode 17 of Music is Not a Genre. Each week I take a release from my collection, I discuss it, I give you my take on it, I throw in some interesting stufferino, and I connect it to my music, and other things in the world. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed and clicked and shared and listened and watched, shared and subscribed. If you are a Patreon member, thank you very much for that. Thank you for being a part of this at all. Fun fact, by the way, speaking of Patreon, this is actually my 233rd week doing this. Not anything special about that number, except that I wanted to say it. Most of the early ones were text and photos only. I used to call it the Thursday Throwback Track. I may publish them someday, and if I do, they will be on Patreon. You can see some of the writings like this. Those are notes. So this week is a continuation of my new series. It's Death is Dumb, Volume 2, STP, The Reinventor's Edge. So first of all, I'm going to get out right away, before we get into this. Yes, I am old enough to remember that there was a product called STP, was a motor oil or something, and the tagline was the racer's edge. So that was the reference I was making there. I honestly don't know what that STP stood for. Not really a racing fan. This STP, however, is not that. This is, of course, Stone Temple Pilots. And so the best place to start here, I think, is where they kind of came of age, where they became popular. Grunge was a thing, right? Grunge was a huge thing. It was born in the 80s. There were quite a few good bands in the 80s that were grunge that no one knew about. They're very underground. It blew up in the early 90s, was hugely successful up and through the mid-90s, and then got co-opted by both the industry and later bands into a kind of almost parody of itself. And I will refrain from mentioning any of those bands' names out of respect for them, Nickelback, because everyone has done their absolute best, whether they were early in the grunge scene at the peak of it or later on co-opting the sound, Nickelback. Now listen, so trends come and go, right? And the bands that last, the bands that can outlast trends, that are not defined by trends. So what did grunge bands do when grunge kind of had its day and other things took over? Some of them quit. Some of them, frankly, didn't survive it. Some doubled down and stuck with their sound and maybe ended up doing kind of grunge tours and, the circuit, basically, the live circuit. Didn't maybe put out any new material as far as recordings go. Some evolved, like Pearl Jam, who evolved almost immediately, in through the mid-90s even, into a much richer and fuller band that had more elements than just the grunge to them. And some reinvented themselves in various different ways. You can kind of say Foo Fighters is that way, in that Dave Grohl took what was grunge and turned it into something else, STP, Stone Temple Pilots, really was a mix of the last two, the evolution and reinvention, and honestly did also do the first two. There's a point at which, early on, when they doubled down on the grunge, thing, and later on, when they quit, they just, and I think if you know any of their history, you understand why they quit and everything, and I will get into some of that, right? And this is the thing, Stone Temple Pilots always seemed to me like the odd child out of the mix when you're talking about bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, and those to me are always the big four, and I know there are more, like the wonderful, wonderful people at Candlebox. More on that later. Stone Temple Pilots, when they started, you wouldn't be at fault for thinking that they were just trying to imitate what was already out there, because the sound that they had and the kind of plotting kind of, you know, production and the way Scott Weiland sang was very much like it could have been an offshoot of a Nirvana or not Nirvana, I would say more Pearl Jam or Alice in Chains. And a lot of people thought, oh, he's just imitating that kind of grunge voice, you know, like singing, you know, bombastically in sort of a, you know, deeper metal way, I guess you could call it. And I did. I frankly, you know, in that first their song "Creep" and the one and even "Plush," and even though they were good songs, they weren't my favorite band then. During the Core years, their album "Core," which I don't have here, that's evidence that they were my favorite band. But they had depth and range from the get-go, so they were, you know, destined to go somewhere more than that. They started in the '80s, actually, on the West Coast, I believe, as a band called Mighty Joe Young, but I'm pretty sure that there was another band of that name. So when they, you know, had to change their name, and they changed it to Stone Temple Pilots. You can go ahead and look up why they did that. That's not why I'm here today. And Mighty Joe Young, by the way, if anybody knows, it was sort of a, you know, lighthearted knockoff of King Kong, in a way, is how I would put it. A movie from the, I want to say 50s. Could have been late 40s. I don't remember. I used to watch it as a kid with my family. They did a remake of it in the last 20 years. Didn't see that. But that's where they got the name from. So Stone Temple Pilots. When they hit Purple, the album Purple, which I also don't have, the song Vaseline came out. That's when my ears went, whoa, wait a second. There's a rhythm there. There's a way even the guitars are being done. There's something even that Weiland's starting to do with his voice that really started to pique my interest. I was like, okay, I'm going to listen and see what happens. It was somewhat of a retread in some ways of Core, but it certainly moved forward, right? But it wasn't until this album, and people listening, what I'm doing now is holding up the album, Tiny Music, Songs from the Vatican Gift Shop, with that swimmer on there with the swim cap in front of the pool. And I will put that down the front now. That's the album that really, for me, went, oh my God, these are not just grunge hangers-on or imitators. They really know what they're doing and are trying to do a bunch of different things. I mean, there are songs on this album that to this day just, you know, blow me away. And unfortunately, I'm looking here for the list. Isn't this great? You get to see this. But there's a song I used to do a lot when I did coffee houses and acoustic, and it's a Lady Picture Show. And it's just a beautiful song. That's nothing like what they did on Core and Purple. Even Tripping on a Hole in a Paper Heart. Not really what they did on Purple, you know. So these are just a couple of the songs that are on this, I mean, Big Bang Baby. When that came out, I thought, okay, so now Weiland is taking his voice and morphing it from kind of an Eddie Vedder imitation into like a punk John Lennon. There really was a John Lennon tone. If you listen to Big Bang Baby and tell me that it doesn't sound in some ways like John Lennon, if John Lennon was, you know, was more punk. Not that he didn't have his punk elements in some ways. But that album, oh my God, like just I was hooked and knew that from that point on, I would listen to everything they did. So then they released this album here, number 4, which has the song Sour Girl, among many others. But that Sour Girl, again, was like, oh, wow, so they're going somewhere else now, you know? And if you know anything about the kind of music I like, you know that I like bands who are willing to bust through genre, who are willing to experiment, even if the experiments don't always work, who are willing to stretch themselves. And the two elements in Stone Temple Pilots that really enabled that to happen are the DeLeo brothers and Weiland. And not to say that the other members of the band didn't, of course, they were there, they kick ass as well, but as far as creative force, as much as I know of them, the DeLeo brothers were really the driving force and are still the driving force behind the band. They're still at it. And more on that later. And Weiland, his ability to experiment with his voice and stretch his voice and take it places where it hadn't gone before and just do it so incredibly well, dynamically and effectively, convincingly, was really what, to me, made them, I think, unsung heroes of that era. A band that doesn't get a lot of talk today. And I feel like they should, because they were, to me, I always used to say they were the Guess Who of the 90s. You know, because the Guess Who band, you know, late 60s and the 70s, had tremendous number of hits that were kind of, you know, rock with some power pop elements in some ways. They stretched into different genres and stuff like that, but they were never quite as big as some of the other bands of that era. And to this day, you'll hear a Guess Who song here and there. I covered a Guess Who song, and just heard another cover of that same song, New Mother Nature, No Sugar Tonight, by a reggae artist that was freaking incredible as well from way back then. And they have kind of fallen through the cracks in some ways historically, although thankfully more people are remembering them. I'm hoping the same thing happens with Stone Temple Pilots, in that, of course, please give props to Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and anyone else you want, a Mother Love Bone, you know, any of that stuff, because I do, and it's incredible, and I will talk about them at some point too. But don't forget Stone Temple Pilots. Please don't forget them. Listen to, in fact, and I'll get there in a second. So anyway, they released Shangri-La Da shortly after number 4. And the song off of that, unfortunately, I don't recall. But I remember it being a pretty good album. In the same way, Smashing Pumpkins, another great grunge band that evolved and still had hits into the late 90s. You know, and then they broke up. No, this was was this late? I think this was the early O's, I want to say. Early O's. I should be able to tell you, right? Because this thing is right here in my hand. And hand, I say the word hand like that. Yeah, 2001. So sorry, yeah. Into the early O's, I mean, not many other grunge bands were able to do that. Right? They kept doing hits because of the DeLeo brothers, because Weiland was able to, you know, donate essentially his creativity vocally and lyrically, even through all his struggles. But as I was saying, if you don't know this, if you don't know that Stone Temple Pilots are a band worth listening to, pick up this album here. I'm holding up for you listeners the album Thank You from 2003, which is their hits collection up to that point. And I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and, you know, list them: Vaseline, Down, Wicked Garden, Big Empty, Plush, Big Bang Baby, Creep, Lady Picture Show, Tripping on a Hole in a Paper Heart, Interstate Love Song, I forgot that one, All in the Suit That You Wear, Sex Type Thing, Days of the Week, Sour Girl, Plush. And no, that is not, there are many more great songs by them, but this is, and I mean, put this on, you know, this playlist on, or however you listen to music, in a car while you're driving or while you're commuting or whatever, and listen through and tell me that they're not worthy of more attention and recognition, you know, historically speaking. And today, why not, right? You know, I'm a fan of bands that stick it out even after their bigger heyday has come and gone, because guess what? There's a chance that they could come back. It happened to U2 over and over, where people thought, okay, they had their hits, they're done. And then the early 90s came. They had another big, yeah, okay, that was it. And then the late 90s, early O's coming, oh, you know, Beautiful Day. And it just keeps happening. You know, it doesn't happen with every band, but so what? The fact that they're still out there, the same way that Alice in Chains are still out there, shows that it's about the music, and it's about the people involved in the music and wanting to continue to contribute that music to the world, you know, and create that and put it out. Which Stone Temple Pilots did, even though they broke up before this album, Thank You, right around that time. And Weiland went on to co-form the band Velvet Revolver with some people from Guns N' Roses and somebody else, I think. Put out a couple albums which were pretty good. There's some good stuff on there. And I'll talk about that at a certain point as well. And then that kind of ran its course, although Weiland was in several other bands and helped to form several other bands, some of which did record their material. Back in 2010, they recorded an album just titled Stone Temple Pilots, which was damn good, and was a period in which they were thinking about reforming, and they even through the 2011, 12 early teens, they were talking about getting back together and doing some more things. And then, if you know anything about this history, you understand why that didn't happen and why Stone Temple Pilots are Death is Dumb Volume 2. In that, Scott Weiland, who had struggled with drug addiction his entire life, died, overdosed, in 2015 at the age of 48. Not 27, not that magic number. We lose so many people, musicians, which I'll talk about that at some point. But 48 isn't old, and they were still at it and still getting ready to do more music, and he's a family and all of that. It's tragedy no matter how you slice it. And death is dumb, That is a mental illness, an emotional illness, as much as it is a physical illness, drug addiction. And he tried over and over to kick it, and couldn't do it. And so, we'll never have his voice in the world again. And that kind of thing gets me. Because even though Stone Temple Pilots are still at it, they replaced Weiland before he died because he was, he was fired because of his drug issues. They couldn't, function as an entity, as a band, with Chester Bennington, who was on hiatus, I guess, from Linkin Park. And if you know anything about that band, you know that Chester Bennington is now dead. And after he died, they replaced him with a guy named Jeff Goot and recorded 2 albums with him that I have not heard yet, but will be listening to very, very soon. They're on my listening list. And so why are they still at it after Weiland's death? It's because of the DeLeo brothers. It's because they started the whole thing. They're the driving force behind it. They deserve more recognition than they've gotten. Not that Weiland doesn't deserve all the praise he's gotten as well. And they released an album as recently as 2020, as last year, which, they're still at it. They probably would have toured if touring had existed last year. And again, yes, credit to the DeLeo brothers and to that band for soldiering on. And I hope that the 2 albums that I haven't heard yet are as good as the rest of this stuff. And I imagine a lot of it will be. And I think I may have actually heard the one that they released in, I want to say 2018, way back. But I stopped buying CDs, as you can see, around 2011. So I don't have it here. That was also titled Stone Temple Pilots. It was a reinvention, I guess. In 2020, their album was titled Perdita. Just for your information. But despite that, or, along with the DeLeo brothers deserving that recognition, really, it was Weiland who brought this band home for me, and it's because of what he did with his voice. Talked to a friend once, I interviewed her, actually. She was my second interview in my series, and I asked her why she wasn't a fan of Rod Stewart, and I'm not passing judgment on that. And she said it's his voice. And some people love Rod Stewart's voice. She does not. And very often, some people can't listen to The Cure, let's say, or, just pick any vocalist. If they're not your type of voice, doesn't matter how good the music is or what else you might have liked about the music. If the voice doesn't bring it home for you, you won't be into it. That's what Weiland did for me. He not only did that, he helped me transition my own voice at the time. Because I had started as a jazz, musical theater, and pop singer, taught myself, and through working with bands and stuff, to sing rock music and grunge and punk and all of that stuff, and blues. And at that time, a lot of my vocals were kind of stuck in that, grunge range, that full-throated singing voice that you needed to have. And fine, there's a song of mine called Away, which I put a link to where you can hear that. in some of the wailing parts of that song. But when, Weiland and other artists, but particularly Weiland, I heard his voice morph, and I was like, oh yeah, I need to come out of this depth. I need to allow my voice to get more bright and dynamic, and not worry that fullness of tone is how everything should be sung. That's just not the case when you're dealing with pop and rock in particular. You can do whatever you want. Your voice is an instrument. It doesn't always have to have perfect production in terms of classical training or operatic style and things like that, and the way that a voice is used. Use it well, so you don't mess it up, but it can sound however you want it to sound. And Weiland helped me realize that. And so listen to a song like Away, and then listen to the next song I put the link to, Some Things Happen. And you'll hear a huge difference. You can hear it's the same voice, but you'll hear the difference. And I believe, among several others, but maybe primarily, Weiland was the reason for that. Because, I followed other singers who had completely different styles from grunge, but to have gone from that style into other styles showed that an evolution can occur not within one voice. And not only that it is acceptable for one artist, one band, to have a singer who can do whatever they want with their voice. Not every song has to sound like Plush or Creep. It can sound however that's the service of the song and the lyrics and the emotion of it, and whatever the hell the lead singer wants to do. So, death is dumb, goddammit, and thank you, Weiland, and thank you, Stone Temple Pilots. Please listen to them, and please listen to the 2 links that I put down there. Do you even know them? Do you remember them? Have you listened to them recently? Did you listen to them back then? Do you remember any of their hits? Were you also surprised, if you followed them, by how much they changed through the 90s? How they morphed in kind of in a similar but different way to how Smashing Pumpkins morphed, and in a very different way to how Pearl Jam morphed. What did you think of Weiland? What did you think of his voice? Do you remember when his voice kind of shifted, and he showed that he could do more than just that, big grunge singing? Do you know anything about the other bands he fronted? I know Velvet Revolver. I don't know much about the other couple ones. Some of them were kind of superstar bands, people from other bands who came together to form a band because restless dude, loved music, just wanted to keep creating no matter how, even through all of his struggles, which I find valiant. He could have retired after the first couple of albums, but no, he didn't. Anyway, I want to know what you think of all this. I want to know how you feel about that, or if there's some other grunge band or if someone from that era or a different era who died who still devastates you. So that's what this part of this series, this mini-series, Death is Dumb, is about, is to share in that it's important enough for us to honor these people and say that even somebody we don't know, it can hurt when they die. Thank you for listening and for watching and for clicking and sharing and for subscribing and for everything that you do here every week and for answering and for commenting, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. I'll see you next week.